the first two words of my, I made some loose notes, Samir assuring me, just make a few little loose notes that he was just going to say a few things. It's why me, is what I've written here. And I suppose part of that is because Samir and the rest of ODI and many of you who are in the academic community were going to enjoy watching one of these humanitarian practitioners that, yeah, it almost makes you swell with pride being part of the cartel. You know, I have been at the forefront of bleeding, you know, on and on and on about the blurring of the lines and how it's destroying the humanitarian space. The erosion of humanitarian space is one of those buzzwords. I Googled it, 9,400 hits. Shrinking humanitarian space gets 21,000 hits. Humanitarian space itself, only 115,000 hits. So, you know, a full quarter of the people, more or less, who talk about the humanitarian space are also using the word erosion and shrinking in the same short clause. And I assume I've been at the forefront of all of that, and I assume I'm also invited here today to beg forgiveness because we've clearly got it wrong. I want to say when I read the report, I was just very impressed, and I think I don't want to repeat everything that's really quite right with the report because I think it hits the nail on the head. I assume many of you have come here today to, you know, essentially attend the funeral of this discourse, this common narrative of, you know, the erosion of humanitarian space. It just doesn't exist. And I think they've done a very, very good job in this report of not only delineating it, you know, where it came from and why it doesn't exist, but also looking at some of the consequences of that. And I want to come back to a few of those things. The consequences of it, essentially this own misperception. In the report, it talks about essentially three definitions that we use out there for humanitarian space. And the first one is agency space. It's just where, you know, the space that we need to operate. And that, I think, is by far and away the most common usage I would see inside MSF. We talk about the humanitarian space as this mythical, you know, sometimes we're harking back to a golden era that didn't exist, but it's that space inside of any particular context in which we're able, I suppose, to run around unfettered because everybody acknowledges that we are an apolitical body there to do good and do no harm and all of those other things. You know, angels having descended into the political fray, and that is what we talk about. That is how we use, that is how I use humanitarian space. They also offer a couple of other definitions like affected, you know, the space in which the affected community lives. And I think the fact that I would see that so rarely as actually the way in which we use humanitarian space to talk about essentially the space in which, you know, whether it's the local population lives and the things that affect them and their access to humanitarian assistance, to protection and things like that. And it's a proper definition, but I doubt many of us really use it that way when we talk about it. And I think that says a lot about us. And then the IHL defines space, that I think the ICRC would be the one practitioner that tends to use it that way. And then they've put together a definition that they think we should use, and that I think is obviously much better. It's a definition that considers the very complex, you know, political, military, and you know, sort of legal arena in which we work. And I think, as Samir explained, it's in a space that doesn't really expand or shrink. It exists. And what you need to do as a humanitarian is to go into that space and essentially, you know, negotiate by elbow or otherwise, you know, go about your business. But you have to go about it in a much more realpolitik way. I mean, this is, you know, this is the Donald Rumsfeld look at the humanitarian world in which we live in. This is realpolitik, and how do you get in there? And I wanted to just maybe spend a few moments on how it is inside MSF. I really, as I read this, it just all seems so obvious, and yet we've got this almost pre-Copernican view of this world changing around us. And you know, I suddenly feel like a teenager. I'm sorry, not a teenager. I suddenly feel like a rather overweight middle-aged man putting on my 16-year-old blue jeans, and I can't get into them. I can't even get close, and I'm thinking the jeans shrunk. I mean, the world, these external factors have changed, and we still have this self-image, I think, of ourselves, of the way we were 20 years ago, if not 30 years ago. And I'm going to come back to that. So we definitely talk about the shrinking space a lot. I think we also look at politics as sometimes something outside of us. We will admit that our actions have political consequences, but certainly not that we have political objectives or aims behind our actions, or that we are a political player for that reason. And I think that's something that we need to struggle with. It's also, you've probably heard of the whole strong state discourse. A lot of inside humanitarian organizations, what a lot of people have been talking about is strong states. There are all these states out there that have all of a sudden gotten stronger, and they're controlling us. And again, this is this idea that we don't see how we've changed, how we, for instance, have become an actor that will go to the United Nations Security Council, call it to order, tell them, hey, the government of this country is abusing its people, and with all that's essentially the action of a global power, powerful global actor. And that's what we individually, as MSF, but also as a community of the cartel, these major NGOs have become very, very powerful actors, and well budgeted, well capable. And at the same time, we seem to believe that we're just those naive, young, long hair hippies kind of giving out nice things to people, and the governments should just leave us alone while we do that inside their sovereign space. And I think the other way in which we talk about it is inside MSF is really the voice of frustration. When you look at Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Somalia, North Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, the list goes on and on of places where our actions in MSF should be quantitatively greater. We should have more impact that way, but just the whole breadth of them, what we are doing in those places is far insufficient to the needs on the ground, and we're not able to do it. And the shorthand description of that is we don't have the space to do it. And often that's linked in with, sort of either the regulatory environment that is imposed upon us or the security environment. And that those are all simply uncontrollable external factors, I think is often the kind of shorthand way of looking at that. But it just seems like, kind of a way of working in the world where there's a great sufferential nature to this, and at the same time, a real solid lacking of self-awareness. I'm going to come back to that. It's hard to figure out how you can be so self-referential and at the same time so lacking in awareness. I think, Simon Cowell would be the only one that would approach that kind of. Can I not get quoted as just calling MSF the Simon Cowell of the humanitarian world? That's the bad news in terms of MSF. Now I'm going to flog our book, Humanitarian Negotiations Revealed, the book with the least attractive cover ever designed by a graphic designer. Can I actually not have that also go out? No, because there is a counter discourse, and I really think that we've been forced to really, and at a couple places in the report, I think there's a quote or two from Humanitarian Negotiations Revealed. I want to start in the introduction with Marie-Pierre Allier, the president of MSF France, who just talks about, it examines the precept that political exploitation of aid is not a misuse of its vocation, but its principal condition of existence. And because acknowledging that humanitarian aid is only possible where it coincides with the interests of the powers that be does not have to mean giving away to political forces. It doesn't mean giving away the whole shop on principles, but it means a real politique analysis of the context in which you work and how do you deliver aid in that context. And there's a lot of case studies in here. I hope people are familiar with the book. I want to read a quick comment from it from the chapter where Michiel Hoffman describes some of the work he was doing in Afghanistan. And he talks about basically these remarks point to the same evidence, namely that humanitarian action is a symptom of war, not a cure, of war at least. They also highlight what this chapter has attempted to show. For MSF's action to be accepted, the main political and military stakeholders in war have to recognize the conflict as such and have to have an interest in the medical services the agency can deliver. It's about understanding interests, it's about understanding the power that's there on the ground, and it's about understanding that while the principles have meaning, they only have meaning within a given context. And I think I don't want to go much further into that. I just want to leave it that this is where I think a lot of NGOs, where we need to improve. We need to shed the idea that there's just this mythical space out there, and we need to enter the real world. And I think this report does a good job of talking about that. I wanted to highlight just one of the other reflections I had of reading it is that there's this whole the advocacy and protection side of humanitarian action, and the report does a very good job of saying this is embedded in the idea and the principle of humanity. Humanitarian action cannot just be about the sterile distribution of goods and services. It has to include more than that, and that's whether it's a solidarity with victims of violence or some kind of work in terms of their protection. To limit it down to just giving out things is a mistake. It goes back to what Samir just talked about, the well-fed dead. And yet it seems, and I think it's really interesting, that what they've developed is a link here between our own misperception of the humanitarian space as something sort of agency space and our discourse around it and everything else, and at the same time the limiting down of our actions to what they call or term the stay and deliver mode. And I think it's really important that we understand, let me just think of how to cut this real quick, that we understand that's a very real consequence out there, and you see it in a number of places in the book, places where MSF essentially decided to stay and deliver rather than use its voice or risk using its voice. Lastly, just to maybe summarize what I would call not a critique, but just when I reflected on their own definition of what they call the humanitarian space and what they're proposing, this sort of complex political environment, what I also see is that there's the persistence of that misperception. I mean, we're not all idiots, and yet how is it the report describes that misperception, how we believe this agency space is synonymous with humanitarian space, and yet it doesn't really explain where it comes from. And I think there's something in that. It has lingered quite a while in the face of facts that you would think are fairly incontrovertible, and we might have come to a slightly different understanding of it. And I would propose that to a certain extent this humanitarian space and the definition we give it isn't about agency space. It's about agency myth, agency genesis, agency ideology, and most importantly agency identity. And it's about sort of that myth of the savior, the great white or great Western savior, and that is a big part of what we talk about when we talk about the space in which to work. And I think the danger of that, and why I highlight it here, is that it also implies, actually I'll back two more comments. One is Samir and Sarah do a nice job of describing how humanitarian agencies to a certain extent control a very large proportion of the discourse around some of these conflicts. We have media teams, they're very effective, they get the word out, and that word is essentially this myth of our ideology and the implication of that the people, the governments, in particular governments and militias or armed groups where we are bad guys. And we control that myth, and I think to a certain extent what you would see then is that our own propagation of our identity through this idea of humanitarian space is actually what undermines it to begin with, because it implies it's a very aggressive attack, this idea of humanitarian space, the way we see it and use it. It's an aggressive attack on the people that actually are in sovereign control of the territory. And I think maybe I'll just leave it at that, just to pass it on to Randolph.